So thanks everyone for joining us tonight on our discussion panel about spanking. We are here with Kelly, who is our anti-spanking expert. I'm going to give you some tips on how to switch over if you think that might be best for you and your children. And then we're also here with Jordan, who is our spanking expert, and he is all for it. So Kelly, let's go ahead and start with you introducing yourself to everyone.
Okay. I'm Kelly Nichols, and I am glad to be here with April and Jordan in on this discussion. I am very much anti-spank. I wouldn't say that I'm staunchly anti-spank because I'm not going to try to be in your face on anti-spanking and how horrible it can be. I'm more here for information, sharing knowledge, helping you figure out different ways to discipline your child that does not involve spanking. There's lots of research I've done on, benefits of not spanking a child and ways that you can, in fact, discipline and have successful discipline when your child is needing it.
Nice. And Jordan, what about you?
I am Jordan Zeitler. I am for spanking. Not beating your child, obviously, but spanking in a productive and effective way. So I'm looking forward to it.
Kelly, how did you get into this anti-spanking? Did you spank before and just feel it wasn't right for you, or how did that happen?
Well, I have personally never spanked my son. Now, before he was born, I was just under the assumption that I would spank. I grew up being spanked. Everyone I knew grew up being spanked, and it was never, an issue. I did not like being spanked. Growing up in the South, being from the South, it was just kind of what was expected. If you acted up, you were going to get spanked. And I wasn't so anti-spank until the older my son got. And I don't know, I've never really I've never needed to spank him. And I know that there are a lot of kids out there who, for lack of a better term, are a little, rambunctious or harder to deal with. Luckily, Gavin was really never my child was never really hard to handle. Now, there was one specific point, he was 4 years old, I remember. We were having a really horrible day, and I was at my wit's end, and that's usually when spanking happens, is when a parent is completely stressed out at the end of the day. They've had a hard day, they're tired, they don't know what else to do, so they lash out, and that's typically when a spanking occurs. And so I did tell Gavin that I was going to spank him, and I actually pulled out a belt, and because I didn't know what else to do, but when he literally, the look of fear on his face, because he had never looked at me that way. He had never looked at me with fear in his eyes or was scared of me and ran from me. And he did that night. And I immediately put the belt down, and that was when I knew that I could never hit him. I could never use my hand or an object to instill fear into my child as a means of punishment or discipline.
Okay, and Jordan, what about you? I mean, did you, going into parenthood, did you think, was that even an issue or a consideration as far as like, should I spank my child or should I not, or how did that come about for you?
Well, I was spanked as a child, so when it came time for me to have children, I always said that I wouldn't spank my kids. I was very much against it. I remember Zach was 6 years old, and he decided he wanted to run away from home. And and I woke up in the morning. We had just moved from South Carolina to here in Missouri, and I woke up to this woman standing in my bedroom who I had never met before. She was a complete stranger, And she said, I have your son at my house. And I did spank him for that. The reason I did is because I think sometimes the only way to get through to a child that this is not at all acceptable is to spank him. It wasn't a beating. I mean, it was a couple swats on the butt, and I think I cried harder than he did. And I mean, I think I spanked Zach twice, maybe 3 times, but they were all for very good reasons, and I never spanked him out of anger. And that's one of the main things you have to remember, is that if you're going to spank your child, you have to be level-headed about it, and you have to make sure they understand that you're not spanking them because you dislike them or you want to hurt them. You're trying to teach them a lesson. And it's not something that needs to be done for any lesson. It's an extreme condition. I mean, I wouldn't spank him just for any reason. So, now Ethan, I've spanked him quite a few times, but for those of you that know Ethan, but but I also remember I remember watching an episode of Dr. Phil, because I grew up, if a child bit you, you bite him back. Okay? And a lot of parents, I'm sure Kelly is probably wincing right now thinking, what kind of parent would bite their child? But I did it with all of my kids. I mean, all of them bit at one point or another, and I bit them back, and they never bit again. They knew that it hurt. And I remember watching Dr. Phil, and it was about a child that bit everybody. And I'm sitting there, and I'm saying, just bite the kid back. Bite the kid back. All you have to do is bite him. And Dr. Phil looked right at the camera and said, and don't bite your children. I'm sorry, I'm going to bite my kid if he bites me. So, but I would never do anything to any of my kids out of anger. I make sure that I'm very level-headed before I hand out a physical punishment.
So with these extreme situations where you are pro-spanking, can you give us some examples of what those would be?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when Zach ran away, even though it was right across the street, it scared the crap out of me and my, at the time, my wife. And, and that's something that he needs to know, that it's extremely dangerous. And I don't know, I feel like him getting spanked over it made it more effective. I mean, one of the other times was he stole something from Walmart. It was a watch that he wanted. And we got out to the car, and we had told him in the store he couldn't have the watch. And we get out to the car, and he just started crying. I mean, just uncontrollably crying. And finally, he pulled the watch out of his pocket. And I took the watch back in and gave it back to Walmart and everything. And when we got home, I told him, stealing is bad, you shouldn't do it, and I spanked him. He understood that he was being spanked because what he did was wrong, and he knew not to do it again. And he's never stolen anything again. He's never tried to run away again. Like I said, the 2 or 3 times that I've spanked him, he's gotten the message.
So, Kelly, in those kind of situations, as an anti-spanker, what would you choose to do in those events?
Well, my whole policy with raising kids is transparency and honesty. In the situation where a child's stealing, now a point that I did want to touch on is how Zach knew when he got in the car that he had done something wrong, and he started crying right away. That right there shows that he knew already what he was doing was wrong. And so that further proves that kids can understand and absorb honesty, and they get it. They can, they understand the truth. They can handle the truth. And so in that type of situation, he already knew what he had done was wrong. And so with going home and explaining what you did was wrong, and now I'm going to spank you, it's I believe that he already knew. I believe at that point when he got in the car, he had already known that what he did was something that was unacceptable. And by sitting down and explaining to them, stealing is wrong. You're taking money out of, out of a corporation from hardworking people. Now, Walmart, let's not go into the whole Walmart being a person thing or a good corporation, because we all know they're not. But that's a different discussion together. But explaining that stealing is wrong, you're taking away from innocent people. You're already clearly visibly upset. You already know that what you've done is wrong. So half of the lesson has already been taught. And so by teaching him, by sitting down and, just really taking it home that what you've done is wrong, it's unacceptable, there are other ways to go about it, there's hard work, there's, you can do chores around the house until you save up enough money to buy the watch that you want, but stealing is never the answer. And in that situation, I think that the spanking could have been left out of the discipline because he already knew what he did was wrong.
And so with Jordan, I mean, kind of back to you on that one, in that moment as a parent, do you think that you would have been able to effectively feel like you got your point across without the spanking and just talking about it? Or do you think that it's kind of one of those that it helps get the point across? Like, how does that kind of go with you?
Yeah, I mean, I probably could have done it without the spanking. But at the same time, Zach knows that if he's getting a spanking, it's because he did something very wrong. Yeah. And I mean, so those few times that I've spanked him, he knows that they're very serious conditions. And I also, like I said, I would never spank him out of anger. I let and I mean, in all honesty, I was more proud of him than anything that he told me the truth. And I made sure he understood that, and we had a very long discussion after that. I was proud of him for telling the truth and that he wasn't being punished because he told the truth. He was being punished because of what he did, And so, I mean, I think too many times parents spank their kids and they just leave it at that. Or they spank them out of anger and they don't take the time to reinforce that they're spanking out of love and not out of hatred or anger. And I think that's one of the most important things is if you do have to spank your child, make sure it's for a good reason and make sure you explain to them that you do love them and you're spanking them because you love them and you want them to understand that what they did was extremely wrong.
Right.
So, but yes, to answer your question, yeah, I probably could have handled that situation without the spanking because he came forward, but I felt that it was a serious enough thing that, like I said, he got a swat on the butt and, nothing real major. I've never hit him with anything but, or I shouldn't say I've never spanked him with anything but my hand because I don't think that's right. I was spanked with a belt growing up, and with my mom has huge hands, so we used to beg her to spank us with anything but her hand because that thing hurts. but yeah, and I honestly, when I spank them, I don't even hardly hit them. Yeah. I do it more for the effect than for causing the pain. The last thing I want to do is cause pain. So it's mostly to have that effect that you did something wrong. So
right. So what about in like I know for me with my own children, they're all very different, and I know that spanking with my oldest would probably crush her spirit, and like that would be the end of her world. The second oldest, she's just gonna look at you like that's all you have. So I mean, do you feel that way? And how does that play differently when you have one child that you know it would traumatize, and then the other one is just like could care less.
Yeah. Well, I have that. I mean, Zach is a lot like I am. He's extremely emotional. Um, you know, he takes everything to heart. And Ethan, he does to a certain extent, but when it comes to punishment, he cries because he wants you to feel bad. I'll be the first to admit Ethan is a manipulator, and he's very good at it. So he gets out of a lot of punishments because he's so good at it.
And
But
who did you from?
he got that from his mother. but yeah, I mean, Ethan has very thick skin, more than anyone will ever realize, because he cries so much. But 9 times out of 10, he's crying because either he wants attention or he wants you to think that he's more hurt than he actually is.
So Jordan, your perspective is that if parents are going to spank their children, then they need to make sure that they're calm, level-headed when they do it. They're doing it from a place of care and not out of anger. Anything else with that?
No.
Just in the extremes, I guess, maybe.
Yeah. Just make sure that if you're spanking them, it's for a very good reason, not just not every time they do something wrong warrants a spanking.
Right. Okay. And Kelly, so what about you? What about parents that maybe want to try the anti-spanking or have considered it but don't really know what they would do in certain situations? What kind of advice and skills and techniques do you use that you could pass on to those interested in trying it?
I would definitely recommend trying to keep as cool of a head as possible. I know, that parenting can be really hard, especially dealing with a strong-willed child. And I say strong-willed because I have always addressed Gavin as a strong-willed, opinionated person. I don't refer to him as a back talker or a bad kid who has a bad attitude. But I've raised him to be very honest and open, and he's allowed to argue his point with me. He's allowed to sit down with me and say, hey, I don't think what you're doing is fair. I don't think that the discipline that you're doling out to me is fair right now. And he's actually allowed to negotiate with me. And I think that that's important to remember. In order to teach a child how to respect you, you must first respect the child. And I 100% believe that. But if you do want to go the more non-spanking route, even if you have more than one kid, one child, 2 children, 3 children, I would definitely recommend listening. Listening more than anything is probably one of the more important aspects of the non-spanking movement in parenting, so to speak. You understand what's going on because children their brains are developing at rates that we can't quite understand unless we're professionals in that field, because we know not to touch a hot stove. We know not to put a fork in the outlet. We know not to run into oncoming traffic. Children don't know that. They don't understand that what they're doing could potentially be dangerous or harmful. Like when Zach ran away, he knew that he wanted to be away from home at that moment. So for whatever reason, he decided that he was going to leave. And now, just understanding what's going on, understanding that, kids really don't, it depends on their age as well. Like a 2, 3, 4-year-old, they don't understand and grasp the things that an 8, 9, and 10-year-old can understand. And so like if they run out into the road, you scoop them up and you walk them to safety and get on their level, get eye to eye with them, and tell them, like I said, because kids can handle the truth. They understand honesty, and explain to them that if they do it again, they could get really hurt. And it's just, really getting on a level with your child of open communication, listening, understanding, respecting the child, letting them know that if they talk to you in a certain way that's unacceptable, let them know, hey, that's not acceptable. And what I always say to Gavin, whenever he treats me in a way that I don't appreciate, or if he talks to me in a manner that I don't appreciate, I ask him, I say, would you want someone to talk to you that way? And he'll be honest, and he's like, no. I said, well, then why would you speak to me that way? If you want to be respected, if you want me to respect you, you have to respect me. And that has really gotten through to him. It's worked for him. I know that some kids are harder to get that through to. But again, I mean, really the only thing I can go back on is listening, respecting, open communication, getting on their level, and just really trying to treat them like a human being, like a person who deserves to be listened to.
Okay. And so, Kelly, I know that you have a question or two that was submitted by one of your loyal, awesome followers, and that wanted to see if you just wanted to share those with us and kind of bring those points up that they had asked about.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one that I think is a really interesting point to go over is, do you believe, well, first one is, were you spanked as a child, and if so, for what? And I'll go ahead and submit my answer, and then, Jordan and you can submit yours. There's 3 different ones that were specifically noted here, but like I said earlier, I was spanked. I was never spanked in a violent manner. I was never spanked out of anger or frustration. My dad was always the one to spank me, and I knew it was coming. If it was 3 days away, I knew it was coming. My mom, she would, spat me with the fly swatter out of anger or frustration, but I was a force to be reckoned with when I was little. I was a little hellion, but I was spanked when I was younger. For 2 reasons by my dad specifically. My mom would just randomly take the fly swatter down and swat me with it. I don't blame them. I don't hold any ill regard to my parents at all. It was just the way things were back then, just the way that I was probably only in a car seat for the first 6 months of my life. We're evolving. As a human race, we're evolving. Spanking was very well accepted and encouraged across the board pretty much when we were growing up. And as time progresses, it's getting fewer and fewer. But yeah, I was spanked, and I don't hold any ill regard to my parents, and I'm not anti-spank because I was spanked.
Okay, and Jordan, what about you?
I was spanked. I was spanked a lot. No, I'm kidding. I wasn't spanked a lot. But growing up, I took it personally from my dad, because out of the 3 of us, my older sister and my younger brother and myself, I was the only one that my dad ever spanked. And it was on quite a few occasions. But so growing up, I kind of took that personally. But as I got older, I realized that, I was just the one that misbehaved the most. Now, my mom, she spanked us all, um, uh, but yeah, I was spanked as a child, and I think I turned out pretty good. But
Well, I know for me, I grew up in a single parent home, just my mother and my older sister and I. And my mom, she worked all the time. So she was either working 2 jobs and going to school or working 3 jobs. So she was hardly ever at home. So yes, I got spanked, but it was usually around 2:30 in the morning getting woke up out of bed. And it had to be something pretty bad for that to be the involvement. And but I do know that as I got older, it didn't work. But I remember a couple of times before I would go to bed, I would draw out a picture with the words "I'm sorry," and I would tape it above my bed in hopes that she would turn on the lights. So Kelly, what was another question that they had?
Well, there was another question that I think is a really good point to hit on, especially in this conversation, is do you believe that there is a difference between spanking and beating? And absolutely, there is a difference. I do not believe that parents who spank their children, even with a belt on the butt or with their hand, I do not believe they're beating their kids. I do believe that it is hitting because the definition of spanking is to hit on the butt. But beating, there is a difference. Beating is leaving bruises, welts, holding them down in any means possible, just leaving physical evidence that you've inflicted pain onto someone. So no, they're not the same. There's definitely a difference. One is, obvious grounds for a call to CPS, possibly the parent getting arrested, removing the child from the home, and the other one is, a means of discipline that some parents use when they have no other options for discipline.
Jordan, what about you?
I think that there's definitely a difference. A little different from what Kelly said. I believe if you spank your child out of anger and you don't take the time to get level-headed and think about how you want to address it, you are beating your child. Because in your head, you are spanking that child to cause that child pain. Whether it's a small swat on the butt or punching the child across the face. Sorry, I know that's extreme. But you're beating your child. As parents, we have to be responsible enough to punish our children in a mature way. And if you spank your child out of anger, it's not spanking. So
I could agree with that.
I would say I agree with that too. I look at more of the beating, kind of much like you would look at the physical aspects of domestic violence or abuse.
Mm-hmm.
It's always that emotional driven. You see a lot of times people out of anger, maybe even a parent, they're angry, they're not thinking straight, they go to hit their child, they hit their child harder than what they normally would, or maybe they even miss their bottom and they hit their back or their legs, lowering the legs, that kind of thing. And at that point, in my opinion, that is beating. That has moved past because you have let your emotions dictate and guide you. And so I don't think that's ever a good thing, especially when they're aggressive, anger, frustration, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, and I've seen that difference. Like I said, my dad spanked me quite a few times growing up. And he always used a belt, which, hurt like hell, but, it did the job. But he would always send me to my room and tell me to get ready, and he would take a few minutes. And, and he took that time to calm down and, make sure that he wanted to spank me for whatever reason. But I remember one time I snuck out of the house, and I grew up out in the country. The only neighbors we ever had were family. And one family moved in across the street, and they had a boy my age. And I made up some excuse why I wasn't going to go to church that night. And after my mom left for church, I snuck out of the house and went over to play with this kid. And apparently my dad figured it out, and he came over and got me, and he beat me the whole way home. And I mean, it was across the street, but he was whipping me with that belt from their front door to my bedroom. And, and that was the first and the only time that my dad struck me out of anger. So, I mean, you can definitely tell the difference. And like I said, I don't hold it against him. I understand that what I did, I think I scared him. To get that intense of an emotion out of my dad, I think I really scared him. And but there's definitely that distinction. You have to be a responsible parent and just calm down first. So.
Real fast, I don't want to go too far off subject, but this whole conversation reminds me of growing up and being around my grandparents, and you ever get in trouble with them, you got to go pick your own switch and bring it back.
Oh, no, my grandma had a yardstick.
No.
She'd say, go get the yardstick.
My mom would make me go find a switch on the little tree outside. Yeah.
See, now with my mom, I would ask her if she wanted me to go find a switch because I didn't want her hitting me with her hand.
Picking your own is like the worst because you're like, if you come back with this one, they're going to make you get a bigger one.
Uh-huh.
Exactly. I would always pick the thickest one I could find because the thinner they were, the harder they hurt.
Yeah.
All right, Kelly, so what's the next question that you had?
Well, there was also, and this is more for you and Jordan, Jordan for being for spanking and you being kind of in the middle ground on it, is if you are for it or in the middle ground, is there an age minimum and or maximum? Like, do you believe that there is too young of an age to be spanked and too old of an age to be spanked?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. As far as minimum age, there's not a specific age, but the child needs to understand, that what they're being spanked for, they need to be able to comprehend that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wouldn't spank a 2-year-old. I think that's cruel because they don't have the mental capacity yet to understand that what they're doing is wrong. And I mean, and some psychologists or whatever will say that they do, but I don't agree. I think that, maybe 4 or 5 at the minimum. But again, it's going to depend on the child and their progression. And as far as maximum, if the kid's bigger than you are, don't spank them. I mean, you're more than likely going to get a spanking back. But I don't know. I mean, I was 16 when I got my last spanking from my dad. And, did it affect me? No. At that point, it was nothing. My feelings were hurt. That was about it. But I think that once they're reaching about puberty, is a good time to stop. Because at that point there's I don't know how else you would punish them, but I don't think spanking is appropriate after they've reached a certain level of maturity. So
I know for me, I tend to no surprise, go off of the psychology research. And a lot of research here lately shows a very strong correlation to spanking before the age of 2 and behavioral problems as they get older, and so that increased likelihood of spanking them before 2 to having all these behavior issues. So I definitely would say that before the age of 2 is definitely a no. You're not really going to. They're not going to get much out of it, and you're not really going to get much out of it, and unless it's just kind of like, oh, well, at least I did something about it. But then as far as the age, I like to go with, as they start getting into those preteen years, backing away from that and finding something a little more different, because the mentality that I have is that you're training them to become functioning adults, and I just don't see how you can explain that to teenagers, like, oh, well, I'm trying to teach you to be responsible and adult, but I'm going to spank you in the process of it. And so we try to find more creative ways to teach them about responsibility and that kind of thing without doing the spanking, punishment, that kind of way. So we do practice the positive reinforcements and the negative reinforcements, but it's not spanking once they start getting into preteen years, even as early as 9 and 10. I think that at that point it's a good time to start, getting them to kind of move and transition into the thought processes of more adult-like instead of childlike. Instead of going, oh, I know I did something bad, so I'm going to go home and my mom's she's going to whoop me. More like they can take those skills with them and beforehand just be like, I know I shouldn't do this. I'm not even going to want to do it because I don't want to suffer the real consequences. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
And you make a good point, April, as far as not wanting to make a mistake out of the fear of being spanked. That was another thing, growing up when I was spanked, I never, even though I don't hold an ill regard to my parents for spanking me, I never learned my lesson as far as not making the mistake again because it was a mistake. I didn't make the mistake again because I didn't want to get hit again. And that was, something that I've kept in the back of my mind raising my son, because I don't want him to not make a mistake because he's afraid that he'll be physically punished. I want him to learn to not make the mistake because it was wrong and because it's not the correct thing to do or not the safe thing to do or it's not the way you should treat someone. But I can definitely say that from my experience of being spanked growing up, I never not made the mistake because I learned that it was wrong. I didn't make the mistake again because I didn't want to be hit again.
Right.
I'm a part of a group on Facebook for anti-spankers. A lot of the members of that group were abused growing up. A lot of them, experienced abuse from parents, step-parents. So I've gotten firsthand, information from people who grew up in spanking households, in non-spanking households. They share a lot of useful information. I spend a lot of time reading that, and it's important to note that there's correlations with spanking and different types of struggles later on in life, like PTSD. A lot of the people that I'm in the group with have PTSD from being in abusive households growing up, from being spanked when they were growing up. They have little trust. There are studies that show that some children who are spanked grow up to be drug abusers, lower IQs, mental disorders. And that does not mean that if you're spanked, you're going to have these problems. But there is a high correlation of having the physical punishment when you're growing up to developing these issues the older you get. And like other points that I want to make, and now as I've said earlier in private conversations, I have been in abusive relationships with significant others in the past. I have been my son just got home from his dad's. I've been in abusive relationships. I've been, in the situation where if I don't do what I'm told, I'm going to be physically harmed for it. And when you take into consideration, and I'll give you two scenarios where you come home from work and your spouse or your significant other hasn't cleaned the house like you asked them to do, and you hit them. And scenario number two, you come home and your child hasn't cleaned their bedroom like they were supposed to, and you hit them. One of them is considered domestic violence, and the other one is considered loving parenting. And when you put them together in that regard, which one? Why does one outweigh the other? And when if you were to hit your mother or your brother or your significant other, you could get a restraining order. But if you hit your own child, it's encouraged. When in most states and most places it is allowed, and it's illegal to hit an animal in most places, but encouraged to hit your child in almost I think in every state. I don't think it's been, it's been outlawed in other countries, but I don't believe it's been outlawed in any state in the U.S. as of right now. These are definitely things to take into consideration when animals are more protected than children, as far as being, struck with a hand or an object. So that's kind of like my closing statements that I wanted to add into it. There's lots to consider when you think about the legalities of protection when it comes to children, and protection when it comes to other human beings and even animals.
I think that was a really good point, a parallel between the domestic violence versus when you hit your own child. I really like that. Jordan, what do you think about that statement?
I definitely think there's a difference. Like I said, and when I say there's a difference, I mean between spanking responsibly and beating your spouse. If you are beating your child out of anger, like I said earlier, that's the same thing. You are beating your child just like you would be beating your spouse. But just like we said, there's an age limit to spanking. There's never an excuse to spank or abuse an adult. It's not your job to teach them those lessons, whether it's your spouse or your mother or your sister or whatever. But as a parent, it is your responsibility to teach them. And, and sometimes the best lesson you can give them is to spank them, And also, as far as the studies that you were talking about, I definitely agree that there's definitely a lot of correlation with spanking and PTSD and behavioral problems and everything. But I'm curious of how many of those cases come from kids that had loving parents that spanked responsibly, compared to abusive parents. Obviously, if you have an abusive parent, you're gonna be more susceptible to behavioral problems or, long-term effects. But I've never met anyone, and this is just my personal experience. I haven't checked into all the studies and all the, everything, but I've never heard anybody say I had loving parents, but they beat the crap out of me. You know what I mean? I
Yeah.
mean, I think most people, especially our age, almost everybody was spanked as a child. I mean, heck, I was spanked at school once, by the principal. In fact, I was the last child to be spanked at my school. But that was a common thing in our generation. So, but unfortunately, this generation is a lot more emotional. I think I think they're babied a lot more than we were when we were younger.
Well, I think going back to that story, the idea, the parallel between coming home and hitting your spouse for not cleaning the house, or coming home and hitting your child for not cleaning their room. I think we, at least on the spanking side, can agree that the spanking should be done in extreme cases, like they're going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, not something over a bedroom not being clean. But I definitely know that some parents, they will do that, and abusive parents, they tend to do that. I know some really good studies show that lower education and poverty leads to an increased risk of abuse in children. So not just spanking them, but physically abusing them,
Right.
hitting on them, and that kind of thing. And so that's something else to kind of look at too, that education of giving people an alternative, but also poverty level, those types of situations are very high stress. And so that goes back to that acting out emotionally, and not really thinking about it and being rational about it, but just kind of just going off of how they feel emotionally. So they're stressed out, they're worn out, they're broke, and they're just struggling to make it, and every little thing's just kind of wearing at them, and then that's when things kind of explode. So there's a lot of different angles to really kind of look at, and a lot of different avenues to kind of pay attention to when it comes to that kind of either spanking or beating versus each other. So
Yeah, and I mean, and there's also the flip side. What is too little punishment when it comes to parenting? I mean, I think we've all been in the situations where, whether you're in a supermarket or a restaurant and there's that screaming kid, and you're like, somebody just smacked that kid. I mean, I think we've all thought it. I mean, but is it
Kelly's
really the
like, no.
kid's fault? Is it really the kid's fault if the parent hasn't taken the time to teach that child how to behave in public? I mean,
It's not the,
I
right.
mean, with Zach has always been extremely well behaved in public. We have drilled it into his head. When we go to a restaurant, you sit there and you be quiet and you eat your meal. When you're at a grocery store or at Walmart or whatever, you behave yourself. And Ethan is a little more stubborn. He's not as well behaved as Zach is, but he knows better. But I mean, sometimes it's like, rather than say smack that kid, why don't you smack the parent? Because we need to be responsible on both ends. Don't be so lax with your child that they're just a mess, but don't be so physical and destructive that you scar them for life. There needs to be that happy medium. Not happy, but you know what I mean. There needs to be a
Balance.
healthy balance between the two.
Exactly.
So
Yeah. And Jordan, actually, your take on spanking is one of the takes that I can respect. Now, we obviously disagree on whether to spank or not to spank, but the way you explain it, and the explanation you put behind it, and the reasoning that you put behind it of why you spank, is something that I can respect. I do know people who will just whack a kid across the back of the head if they're acting up, or punch them or shove them, not punch them, but just like hit them with something. Like, for instance, about 5 years ago, I think it's been about 5 years ago, I had to take a train ride to San Antonio, Texas. It was like a 22-hour train ride. I had my son with me. The train was full of people, but I specifically remember a family getting on the train, And the boy it was a mother and her 2 children, and I believe an aunt or a cousin was with them. And in my opinion, the boy was not acting out. And I mean, he wasn't loud, he wasn't being disrespectful, but apparently he had angered his mother to the point where she decided to remove her shoe and proceeded to hit him repeatedly over the head and in the face and on the arm and the leg. And I actually said something to one of the attendants, like, are you going to continue to allow this to happen? Because I knew if I said something, she may have turned around and hit me, and then I would have probably hit her back, But
I'd have thrown a shoe at her.
Yeah, I mean, here's a taste of your own medicine. Let me hit you with my shoe. But it's those type of situations. These type of parents believe that this is my kid. I can hit him with my shoe if I want to.
Mm-hmm.
I can slap him across the back of the head if I want to.
Right.
I can hit them with whatever I want. And that's the type of behavior that I am wanting to completely eradicate.
Yeah.
Just completely remove that type of discipline, abuse, whatever you may call it. But it's situations like that I'm completely not behind. But with knowing that there's no anger in the spanking, that even though like I said, I would never do it with Gavin. I would never personally spank him, but I can respect and understand your stance on it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, is there anything else that y'all would like to add to it before we end the broadcast? I know we actually had quite a few viewers popping in and out throughout the whole segment. So next time we'll work on getting that Q&A enabled so we can interact more. But before we go, is there anything that y'all would like to add to the discussion before we close it out?
There was one small kind of little side that I wanted to add to the conversation, and it actually something you brought up, Jordan, is the fact of corporal punishment. There is, currently over a dozen states in the United States that allow corporal punishment. And I am on board and currently am a part of a petition to remove corporal punishment from schools. Recently, there was a situation that went down in Georgia. It's right outside of Atlanta, where a little boy named Thomas was threatened, and the mother recorded, and it's a really disturbing video. If you Google it, you'll find it. Actually, you can Google Justice for Thomas. It's a page that I'm a member of, where he's a kindergartner. He's 5 years old, and he's literally being held down by the principal and the administrators and being restrained, and he's begging not to be spanked. And they allegedly threatened the mother that if they didn't allow him, or if they didn't allow them to spank him, she would be arrested. I am doing more research into that right now, trying to figure out the truth. It's still kind of a new situation, so there's things going back and forth right now. But the fact of corporal punishment and that's still a thing, the fact that there are still schools that allow children to be paddled, there's still parents that allow children to be paddled in school with these wooden objects, is definitely something that for everyone who watches this video, watches the broadcast, jumping in and out, look more into it, and I'm going to ask if you're on board with this whole anti-spanking, way of parenting, is sign the petition. Go to the petition.org and locate the anti-spanking and remove the corporal punishment petition and get that thing signed, because we need to stop these administrators in our school from hitting our kids with wooden objects. But I did want to bring that up because it's kind of, I was spanked a lot in school. At one point, I was spanked so hard that it threw me into the brick wall, and nothing could be done about it because my parents signed the approval that I could be spanked in school, and I really think that it's something that needs to be removed. But that's really what I wanted to throw in there.
Yeah, can I touch on that real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally against corporal punishment. I I think that parenting a child is the parent's job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that doesn't always mean, mom and dad. There's a lot of different roles as parents nowadays. It could be an uncle, a grandparent, whatever. But if you're spanking a child, it needs to be your child. You know, I would, especially, obviously you're against it, Kelly, but say you were for spanking and Gavin was here spending the weekend with me and did something horribly wrong, I may think he deserves a spanking, but I would never spank your child. You know what I mean?
Right.
And, and I would never want to trust anyone else, especially a teacher or an administrator, to take that responsibility with my child for
Mm-hmm.
that reason, because of the way I believe a child should be spanked. And unfortunately, I don't think principals or teachers have the time to step away for a minute and calm down. If they're going to spank a child, it's going to be out of anger, which is abuse. And especially if the child is being held down. I know when I was spanked in school, we were only allowed to be hit 3 times with a ruler, a wooden ruler, and they weren't allowed to touch us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember
Yeah,
going in and he said, put your hands on the desk, and I kind of got into the whole frisking position, and he came, he swatted me 3 times, I cried, and I left.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can trust all administrators and teachers to be that responsible. Like you said, you were thrown into the wall. This kid in Georgia is being held down by multiple people. That's not a spanking, that's assault.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
whoever was involved in that should lose their jobs and be charged with assault.
Yeah.
So I am definitely against corporal punishment. So.
And so, Kelly, was it Justice for Thomas? Is that what it was?
Yep, Justice for Thomas. You can find the page on Facebook. It is a closed discussion, but if you request to join, you'll be approved. And now, like I said, it's still a new developing situation. There's there looks to be a lot of back and forth between family members. Some truths and non-truths look like to be being thrown around, but what goes on between the family is not my concern. I'm concerned about Thomas, about the 5-year-old who was literally restrained by 2 adults, saying, well, regardless, we're going to keep trying to hit you until you sit still. We'll only hit you once unless you squirm, and then we'll hit you again. You're not leaving until we hit you, and if your mom doesn't allow us to do it, she's going to go to jail. So there's a lot, that really has my blood boiling over the situation right now, that I'm going to, keep on top of and see what's going on. But it further proves that corporal punishment needs to be removed from the educational system, because children go to school to learn, and they don't go to school to be hit by anyone. And that's what we really need to bring forward with removing corporal punishment from schools, because the administrators have no business striking a child.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone who has popped in and out and watching our panel discussion on spanking. We've had Kelly Nichols with us, our anti-spanking expert, and Jordan over here, our spanking pro.
Hey, I just want to say something real quick, too. For anybody that is watching or anyone that chooses to watch this in the future, please use the comments below. You know, we want to do this more often. If you have a subject you want us to talk about, we will, leave it in a comment below, and we will definitely do our best to have a friendly conversation about it, just like we did with this. I think we all got
Absolutely.
along. I might smack Kelly later when I see her, but, it's all
And
good.
then I'll just tell you the benefits of not hitting me, and then...
So, but, yeah, so please comment below and let us know what you guys want to talk about and what you want to hear. So...
Okay, and I would just like to throw in also, you can also find myself, Kelly, and Jordan over at the freethinkingpress.com. Read some more from Kelly on anti-spanking, and Jordan keeps us up to date on some really interesting bills. So, yeah, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Y'all have a good night.
Good
You
night.
too. Thank you.